Salut les beaux gosses et les belles gosses. My name is Brian, and today I want to share a perspective that I have on racism that I don't think many people in the world have. I've lived in countries that were homogenous for many, many centuries, like France and Belgium. I've lived in a country that was homogenous in the very beginning, but then slowly evolved to embrace diversity, like the United States. And I've also lived in a country that was already very diverse right from its very founding, like Malaysia. There's definitely a big difference in how people from these different places handle anything related to cultural and racial differences. But I feel like the way people online talk about racism is mostly skewed towards the American experience. So let's start with that. Before I get into it though, I just want to put it out there that this is all based on my personal experience. Your experience might be very different from mine. And if that's the case, I highly encourage you to share it in the comment section below so that we can compare and contrast, and that way everyone can learn from the discussion. I feel like how American culture approaches the issue of race is a huge contradiction. Americans are generally very uncomfortable when it comes to discussing anything about race. They're very afraid of saying the wrong thing, and it's generally not a good look. It is very socially encouraged to speak out against racism and advocate for inclusion wherever and whenever you can. But other than that, race is such a touchy subject that people are conditioned to not say anything at all unless it's absolutely positive. On the surface, this sounds like a good thing, to have people refrain from saying things that could be racist. But once you dig deeper, you kind of notice how a lot of Americans buy into this behavior because they're compensating for something. One time I made a joke by calling a Taiwanese friend of mine a banana, because bananas are yellow on the outside and white on the inside, basically saying that she was whitewashed, and this had always been an inside joke between us. And then a white American girl sitting next to us got so offended that I felt comfortable saying stuff like that. But in hindsight, her reaction was more questionable than the joke itself. Why did such a mild joke between two friends of the same ethnicity bother her that much? Maybe it was because she saw someone else openly voicing out their racist thoughts, instead of suppressing them like she was conditioned to. At least that's how I see it, because any normal person would just laugh at how dumb of a joke that was. Anyways, in America, it's just a culture where people feel like they have to act virtuous and say all the right things just so other people can see them as a good person. And it's just so unsettling when you notice how this doesn't really translate into how people behave in real life at all. There's been a huge push in America to promote diversity and reduce discrimination. Stuff like DEI programs, Black History Month, mandatory college courses on race and social justice. Also look at how much Hollywood has embraced diversity. But when you look at what actually happens on the ground, most friend groups are still decided by race and shared identity. Self-segregation is a big problem, even in places that pride themselves on diversity like New York, where I'm from. I mentioned this as one of the main reasons why I left the US in a previous video, so if you're interested, feel free to check that out. Anyways, one thing I've noticed in my life is how people tend to broadcast what they lack. And when it comes to how Americans approach the issue of race and racial differences, that's basically an example of that playing out on a national scale. What's ironic is that a lot of people outside of the US think of it as a melting pot, and yet in the US, racial division and racial tensions are approaching an all-time high. And then there's also the obsession with race itself. It's gotten to a point where for quite a few years now, college professors have been redefining the word racism to be based only on power dynamics, rather than on any kind of discrimination or prejudice, which is what the actual definition stands for. And then they push stuff like that onto young, impressionable college students. I remember taking a Black Studies class my freshman year of college, which was mandatory, by the way. And while I did learn some meaningful stuff like convict leasing, redlining, how the only community of free Black landowners in New York City got demolished to make room for Central Park, pretty cool stuff like that. But then the professor also tried to drill into us the idea that Black people couldn't be racist no matter what they said or what they did, simply because they don't have the power to oppress like white people can. The crazy thing is, most of the students ate it up, and those of us who thought that it was weird couldn't really question it out loud because we didn't want to risk the professor failing us for a mandatory course. I don't know how racial ideology like this is infecting colleges across the US, because that idea would be considered absurd literally anywhere else you go in the world. It's so obvious to me that racism itself is embedded into the collective consciousness of America. And what's pathetic is how hard everyone tries to cover it up. The only way to get through this is through honest and open dialogue, and a genuine willingness to let go of our preconceptions and actually learn from each other. But so many Americans are so tribalistic that they can't even engage in something as simple as that. In Europe, racism is way less pervasive than it is in the US, mostly because the emphasis is way more on cultural identity here than it is on race. For example, it matters more whether you're German or French than whether you're white or black. Race isn't really that much of a factor when it comes to socializing in Europe. Like, I've seen way more mixed friend groups here than I have in the US, but that doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist either. What's interesting is that I've noticed more people acting openly racist here than in the US. Unlike in the US, where people try really hard to hide how racist they might be, Europeans can drop racist comments very casually, and they're usually unapologetic about it. I haven't really been the target of this myself, but I've seen it directed at Arabs, Indians, and Romani people especially. And it doesn't just happen whenever I'm out socializing or at football games. Like, I've even had bosses and coworkers that would straight up drop racist comments every now and then, which is something that would never happen in the US. That being said, it doesn't really happen that much, but the fact that it does happen from time to time is still pretty jarring. That's usually as far as it goes though when it comes to racism here. So overall, it's still pretty mild compared to the US. And I also feel like Europeans are at least way more open to discussing how their views could be wrong. And that already makes a big difference because in the US, these kinds of discussions typically become hostile and devolve into name-calling pretty quickly. Most European countries already have a very strong identity that they've built over hundreds and some even thousands of years. So while there is a certain level of appreciation and tolerance for foreign cultures, you're still expected to assimilate if you want to live here. I feel like this is a big reason why Europe is becoming more and more right-wing, because that's simply a reaction to how uncontrolled mass immigration has created parallel societies here. I might be wrong, but I don't think this is a trend that necessarily stems from racism. Besides that, I don't really have much else to say about Europe. And finally, we have the Malaysian experience with racism that I feel like most people around the world don't know about at all. What makes it interesting is that it's kind of the opposite of what happens in the US. So to give you some context, there are three main ethnic groups in Malaysia. You have the native Malays, and then you have the Chinese, most of whom immigrated in the 1800s and early 1900s from southern China to work in the tin mines. And then you also have Tamil Indians from the south of India that were brought in by the British Empire to work in rubber plantations as indentured servants. And then we have some indigenous tribes that we call Orang Asli. Racism is literally written into the Malaysian constitution through Article 153 that gives a lot of special privileges to the Malay population. I'm talking about stuff like 90% quotas for public universities, housing discounts, exclusive access to scholarships, high-level government positions, and not just that. Like, all publicly listed companies in Malaysia need to have at least 12.5% of their public shares owned by Malay investors. The Malaysian government has made it very clear that if you're not a Malay Muslim, you're basically second class. And yet, if you travel to Malaysia and you look at how people behave, you wouldn't guess any of that. Like, everyone there lives very harmoniously with each other, and Malaysia is actually one of the most peaceful countries in the world. Of course, some racial tension exists, but most Malaysians don't respond to it with outrage, which is what people usually do in the West. Instead, Malaysians acknowledge it as something that's natural and something that just comes from human nature. One culture might be incompatible with another culture in some aspects, and that's fine. People handle it through give and take. I compromise a little, you compromise a little, and life goes on. It's not like the West where people try to impose on each other. The different ethnic groups in Malaysia generally live within their own bubble, but as a younger person, I would say it's very easy to have mixed friend groups if everyone speaks English or Malay well enough. In my experience, this happens more between the Chinese and Indians, but I did have a few Malay friends here and there. Malaysians are also super comfortable making racist jokes about each other. But the thing is, this almost never comes from a place of hate or prejudice. It's simply a way of acknowledging our racial differences. We don't really mean what we say when we make those jokes, and it kind of brings us closer in a way. At the end of the day, there's a very strong Malaysian identity that everyone has regardless of our ethnic backgrounds. And we care more about uniting over that than fighting over some petty racial differences. Let me give you an example from my own life to show you how normalized diversity is in Malaysia. Something I did all the time with my Chinese Malaysian friends was going to the mamak, which are Indian Muslim restaurants that serve not just food from southern India like roti canai, but also Malay dishes like nasi lemak, and sometimes even Chinese-style fried noodles called mee goreng. It doesn't matter whether you're Malay, Chinese, or Indian, everyone goes to the mamak. But more than the food, they're famous for serving drinks like teh tarik, which is kind of like chai except that it doesn't have any spices and it uses condensed milk. And what makes it special is how you prepare it. Here's a video of me performing it on stage when I was 19. Basically, you do this so that it cools down the drink while giving it a bunch of froth. Again, it doesn't matter whether you're Malay, Chinese, or Indian. Going to the mamak late at night and talking with a friend until 1 in the morning while you both sip on some teh tarik is something everyone does. Anyways, I'm just saying all of this to show you how much people in Malaysia embrace mixing their cultures. So it's just weird for me to see how forced diversity is in the US when it's something so simple and so ordinary here in Malaysia. The irony here is that you have a country that was literally designed to be racist, and yet its people live so harmoniously that it's ranked as one of the most peaceful countries in the world. And if you want a better example, just look at Singapore. Unlike Malaysia, Singapore is a secular state that doesn't discriminate its citizens based on religion or ethnicity, and so they have an even higher level of racial harmony there. Basically, I just feel like Malaysia and Singapore are two of the only truly multicultural countries in the world when it comes to how much their people embrace each other's cultures. Meanwhile, countries like the US and most of Europe are tearing themselves apart trying to make multiculturalism work. America is focused so much on top-down messaging that doesn't actually influence how people behave on the ground. Europe is half-assing the integration process for the millions of migrants that they're flooding the continent with. They have no idea what they're doing, and yet no one has ever thought to look at Malaysia and Singapore as an example of how it can be done. Anyways, I hope that my perspective opened up your mind a little bit and gave you something to consider about how we should approach the issue of race, especially in a world that's becoming more and more racialized. I rambled a lot, and I hope that it all made sense in the end. Let me know in the comments below what you think about what I said. I'm actually really looking forward to seeing how everyone discusses this. I'll be posting a similar video to this next week or maybe even later, so stay tuned for that. I think that's all I have for you guys today, so until next time, have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye now.